Hello and welcome back to another painting video thing with Big Deno. This is a bit of a departure from some of the other painting videos I've put together. This is much more focused on a quick tabletop standard. So this is obviously well, nice drop there, Deno. Good job, mate. A pretty detailed gaming piece from the Cool Mini or Not game Rising Sun. And so I actually have a collection of many board games, and most of them have many awesome miniatures, and in fact that's generally the reason I buy games, because of the cool miniatures. And playing with painted miniatures I think is a significantly more enjoyable board gaming experience. So I try to stay pretty focused on my display stuff, but every now and then I like to have a break and paint a couple of gaming pieces. Eventually I will have a fully painted collection of Rising Sun models. I have 9 monsters left to go. So the process that I follow here is basically a sped up version of the previous processes I've talked about. I started with a Zenithal Prime, and then you would have seen I was using a brush and painting white. So I've mentioned in other videos that using a brush will give you a much stronger color. In the case of white, it will give you much better coverage with a brush than it does through an airbrush. So I like to, when I'm using the airbrush for translucent glazes that leverages the contrast underneath, I like to reinforce the white just to help the translucent layers over the top really have a clear delineation. So this is Magic Blue from Vallejo Game Air, and as you can see it's pretty intense saturated blue. The under painting, the black and the white, is a pretty old technique. I am certainly not the first person to talk about it. I believe some proper painters call it grisaille. I just call it painting in black and white. So what I'm doing here is adding a little bit of shading with my airbrush using a dilute signal blue from Vallejo Game Air, I think. And again, because I'm focused on speed even more so than usual, I use the airbrush in a different way, which is actually for the purposes of creating the shadows and the dark. So I will still go in with a brush, of course. This is the same color, signal blue, but a little bit less dilute, so pretty much straight from the pot. But what you'll see is I don't go back and touch the blue down the lower half of the model much. I tend to focus a little bit more on the upper areas, and so that is effectively the blue done for the lower half of the model. So this guy, he's an Oni. I can't remember. I think he's Oni of swords, skulls, blades, spite. I can't remember. There's a lot of different Onis in the game. They're super cool models, actually. They're really fun to paint. Some of my favorite models. I entered one that has a massive sickle scythe thing over his back and has dead corpses hanging from it, which is pretty legit, in a painting competition, which did well. So I try to spend about 3 hours max on these gaming pieces. This is, I think, a total of about an hour and 45 minutes I spent on this model. So I've sped up to ×2, so you'll be able to see the entire process from start to finish. So here I'm taking some glacier blue and mixed in with the I can't remember what it's called, enchanted blue or magic blue, whatever color it was that I used. I said it before. I think it's magic blue. Just to roughly sketch out some of the skin texturing. I want just basically to follow the shape and the texture of the model. I'm not being precise. It's okay if I don't get it perfect. There's a motto I sort of prescribe to when I'm painting pieces that are going to be used in a game, and that is always remember that they're going to be viewed from several feet away. So that's two advantages. One, it means that people don't look super close generally at the fine detail, so you don't have to worry too much about being perfectly precise and neat. But it also means that really high contrast looks great on the table under normal light. So those are two things I think that are a real advantage in painting gaming models, and you can just be quick and expressive and use very high contrast, and it generally comes out pretty cool. So this next stage is one I have mentioned in previous videos as well. It's difficult to get a real gauge on how a paint job is looking when you have all of these effective blue tones across the piece. So by filling in some of the rest of the colors with something either black, which is going to take your eyes more towards the blue and give you a better idea of what it looks like, or the other colors that you're planning on using on the model, will just give you a better idea of what the blue actually looks like. And so because these models have really a staggering amount of detail for a plastic board gaming figure, this process takes probably longer than it does maybe on some of the display figures I paint, really. So you'll get to watch a little bit of black lining over the next few minutes. I'm just going to take a very quick drink, excuse me. Delightful. A rose lemonade kombucha we are partaking of on tonight's commentary. Tremendous. So the advantage, as I said, of having that really high contrast is that it pops off the table. And I think that's a common error that painters painting purely for a tabletop function mistake is a common error that people make, because it's very interesting to observe how a model looks under the very intense lights of most painting table setups versus how it looks under normal everyday lighting. And in some cases, as I'm sure most of you would know, those gamers, the lighting in gaming events or places is generally significantly worse again than normal daylight. So having something that has more contrast really just helps the model look better, even if it's not necessarily painted to the same standard as some other models. Without the contrast to draw your eye, it's one of those things where I've seen armies that probably should have won Best Painted based on the technical skill and colour choices that they chose lose out to armies that perhaps didn't demonstrate as much technical skill but really had a big pop and a big wow factor. So I like to try and split the difference and not just focus on wow factor, but also some technical skills, and try and straddle the divide between the two. So this is, as I discussed, a copious amounts of blacking in the areas that I'm going to paint with colours, so I can decide if the blue needs more work. This is Chimera Black. I highly recommend Chimera Black for pretty much every application. It's extremely matte, extremely strong, and extremely thin. And it's rare that you want to use pure black for much normal painting, display painting. Black's extremely dark and does some bad things to colors. You usually want to have shadows with other colors, but black lining, filling in lines and using it for non-metallic metals, the Chimera Black is just outstanding. So I highly recommend picking up. If you're only going to pick up a couple of Chimera paints, definitely make the black one of the ones that you select. I also quite like the magenta. It's a very nice color. The white's not too bad. I think it's very similar to this. It's got quite a strong pigment, but it's also very thin, and I feel like that's something of a weakness with the white. So I don't use the white quite as much as I use the black, but it is still one of my preferred colors. Anyway, I'm digressing there into some talk of colors. So you can see now that the blue looks a lot more vibrant just by filling in those areas with black. So I start moving on to some of the other areas and filling in colors. Now this is a bit of experimentation. So I've started incorporating contrast paints, and if you've watched any of my previous videos, you would have seen my usage of contrast paints. Excuse me while I have another sip of kombucha. So I began experimenting with contrast paints around display applications and how I can utilize them. And I've been really pleased with the results, but I've also tried to use them in the manner that they've been intended to use, which is the one coat sort of approach, where you only have to do one coat over a previous layer, and that is supposed to create a finished product. So I've been experimenting with that, and I certainly don't think that is their best way to be used. I think that's a method you can use them, and I'd certainly encourage painters who are at the start of their journey to use them in that way. But I find that they've got a much wider range of applications when they're treated as a strong glaze as opposed to the final result. So this is a bit of charred brown, Vallejo Game Air color, really cool, strong brown, strong pigment, quite saturated for a brown. It does dry very dark, which I like. It's for those old school painters out there, it reminds me of Games Workshop's Scorched Brown, which was my favourite brown many years ago. This is the closest replica I've found. Geez, that was a great colour. So I'm about to utilise the contrast paints, if I remember rightly, because I haven't watched this video in advance, which is outstanding. So the contrast paints, they work when you use them in that manner of as intended. They work, but I don't think they're fantastic for used in that way. So it was a good camera work demo, great work. A little bit of Chalice Red there, which is a Nocturna model color. I think you should use them as a starting point, and that's exactly what I do here to create some interesting colors, some interesting volumes that you can then further refine as you progress. And this is some fun glazes of that Chalice Red mixed in with a little bit of Chimera Magenta. And, oh yes, that's right, I'm doing the straps here. That's fun. Just before I use the contrast paints. So this is, I guess, the way I see contrast paints in the future, how I'll apply them in most of my painting, which is just as a glaze over the top of not necessarily just white and black or whatever else, but over a variety of different colors. So the This is a mixture of ice yellow and charred brown, and I'm putting it on the leather areas, which is obviously a different tone to the white, and it's going to have a different effect when the contrast paints are done over the tops of those. So this is ice yellow mixed in with Chimera Black. Again, you can see here that I've sacrificed accuracy for speed, and not just because I've sped the video up ×2 speed. I'm focusing much more on the clumps of hair as opposed to the individually sculpted strands. I will go back in and touch on the strands a little bit more detail later, but here it's just about placing the highlights where I want them and then adding a little bit more light afterwards. These are a very good way to get into miniature painting, these sorts of models, because, I mean, if you have a look at this, this has got a really interesting variety of textures and volumes and colors that you can use. It's very, very easy to paint something like this, and use a few washes and colors, and it'll come out really cool because the detail's sculpted nicely, and it's also not really a problem if you mess it up. So good experience models, and I definitely recommend, if you haven't, picking up a copy of Rising Sun or Blood Rage and having a crack at some of these models, because they're really, really fun to paint. So evidently I wasn't going on to the contrast color next. I had to do the rest of this brown stuff, which is really cool. Geez, that Chimera Black's good. Great color. 10 out of 10. Okay, so this is actually a color called Verdigris. It's a Vallejo game color. It's actually a slightly green color. And I wanted to put a little bit more light on the skin, because I think the skin's the main point of interest on this model. The other ancillary details are obviously very cool, but the skin's the bright, vibrant blue color that is going to draw most people's eye. So I spend probably a little bit more time on this than I did on some of the other colors. And if I can just be very honest here, I'm finding blue very challenging to paint at the moment. It's a real struggle. I'm either desaturating it so much that it looks like a pale blue, or I don't have enough contrast. I can't seem to quite nail how I want to paint blue. So this was something I was using this piece for, was a bit of an experiment on what colors can I use, what approach can I take, how much contrast do I need to put in on blue for it to look blue and good. And the Verdigris was another attempted color idea. What are we doing now? Yep, more Verdigris. Excellent stuff. So I talk about my painting style and the approach that I take towards painting in some of my other videos, and if you have never watched any of my other videos, I have one on painting a female face, which I'd recommend starting with. It explains my process in a lot of ways, and it's basically a sketch and refine. And so when I say that, what I mean is I roughly sketch out all of the highlights and colors and everything that I want on the model, and then I go back in and refine it. And so by sketching, here I'm just using a bit of airbrush, I'll come back to this in a sec. By sketching the colors very, very broadly, and also sketching in high contrast, you get a better sense of what the finished model is going to look like, without the model actually being finished, of course. And so you can then decide if the approach you've taken is actually something that you're happy with and make changes. And so instead of spending several hours painting a model and realizing you don't like the colors or the way you've approached it, you're spending 20 minutes, 30 minutes to get a really rough idea, and then you can make those changes then. So that was a glaze, and when I say glaze, I mean in a very, very dilute layer that I've painted over most of the model of an ink intensity color called Intense Cyan. Pretty strong blue. Again, experimental blue approach. So here we go. Gore Grunter Fur. So that's, again, you can see how I've used the Gore Grunter Fur over both the pure white sections and then the areas that I've painted with charred brown and ice yellow. And you can see, or you will see when it dries, how they both have a very different effect. I think one of the great things about contrast colors is that you can mix them together on the model. So particularly for colors like browns and leathers, fur, hair, just mixing some contrast colors together over that area and create some interesting shadows, some interesting color play, I think is pretty fun. So would recommend picking up a few contrast colors to have a bit of a play around with. I certainly have been very pleasantly surprised with their application and how much I've enjoyed using them and how much I've actually sort of tried to incorporate them more, even through the airbrush, for example. Quick kombucha break. Again, the intent here is to use the contrast color. This one's called Volupus Pink. Some of the contrast colors do really, really well with this white approach. Others, not so much. So this is one of the colors that it doesn't really work that well with. Whereas the stronger colors, such as the Gore Grunter Fur, it does tend to work much better with that white. So there you can see I was trying to paint each section by section, realized that was a shithouse idea, and so just used the angle of the brush to mostly catch those raised areas. Here's the Volupus Pink. Oof, you can see a lot of that there from that angle. Great work, Deno. There we go. A little bit of Volupus Pink. Do like that color. I really like it on skin tones. It adds a really nice... It's a slightly cold, very slightly cold magenta color, which is pretty nice. So I'll just talk about contrast paints versus washes. So Agrax Earthshade and the old Devlin Mud and those colors, they used to be touted as extremely versatile for gaming purposes. But I'll throw a bit of a curveball and say that I don't think they were that good. And the reason I feel that way is because they have the effect of muddying the color. So because the way that those washes are constructed or designed or whatever it may be, they tend to have a dirtying effect on the color above. The contrast paints, although they're a similar sort of way of being constructed, they have a very different effect, and that is that they will actually increase the vibrancy of the color that they're painted over the top of. So it's sort of a subtle difference, but I think that there's a place for the washes, the Devlin Muds and the Agrax Earthshades and whatever else they're called these days. But I don't use them much in display painting because of that fact that they dirty up the color and they make the color a little bit less saturated and vibrant. Whereas contrast paints, as I said, work in a slightly different way. And so I think they are more applicable for display painting stuff than, say, a Agrax is. So I'm just going to check how long this video has gone for. And it has gone for 24 minutes, which means we've had 48 minutes of painting time so far. And how good is it looking already? Honestly, tremendous stuff for just under an hour. So it's a very relaxing way of painting, I think. And one of my mottos around painting is just painting is supposed to be enjoyable. It's supposed to be an experience that you look forward to. And when you are focused on the minutiae and the very, very finite detail, it's very easy to get downcast and upset at yourself for not being as precise as you would like to be. Whereas this approach, which is just a little bit more rough and ready, is something that you can just sit down and enjoy, even if you make mistakes, even if you do some errors. It's not really a big deal. So that for me is a very relaxing and freeing experience. And as a result, I look forward to painting display stuff as well as painting tabletop stuff, because it's all for enjoyment. And it is enjoyable because I'm not stressing out about mistakes. I will say that many people find it very difficult to let go of the mistakes. I did write a very small article on psychology of miniature painting, which is worth having a read of if you want to. Bit of a sneeze there. If you want to understand a bit more about my mentality towards making mistakes and why I think they're actually a good thing, and how it's very, very rare for you to make a mistake that you can't correct or improve. So those contrast paints, they have one downside, and that is that they have a very shiny finish. So that's something that I control and regulate by using a varnish. So I use an AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. It's a delightful colour finish. Run it through the airbrush. It will have the effect of reducing the gloss or satin finishes of just about any surface that you have on the model, and will allow you to read the colors and everything a lot better. So I find myself using this is a little bit of Snakebite Leather contrast color here, grey color. Also the old Games Workshop color Snakebite Leather was good too, by the way. While we're on the topic of old Games Workshop colors, Snakebite Leather, Scorch Brown, some great colours. Tin Bits. Who remembers Tin Bits? What a great colour Tin Bits was. Used to love that. Anyway, that was another digression. So here I'm working more with the blue again. This is mostly because I wanted to focus on blue. I think they would have been fine how it was. I would have been satisfied with that. But this was, again, an opportunity to learn something new, experiment with my blue, and see how I went. Very good kombucha. So the freeing approach around making mistakes and just enjoying the experience means that this whole model, if you were to have a look at the close-up finished version, you would be able to pinpoint little areas where some of the colors have run over into other sections, and there's a little bit of contrast paint seeping across into other areas. But because I've obviously painted a lot and I've practiced a lot and my paintbrush skill is relatively good, it's probably not an awful amount of those sorts of mistakes. But the one thing I want to say about those mistakes is that it actually has somewhat of a positive effect. And this is one of the things that I talk about in one of my painting classes that I've run, which is just that no object exists in a vacuum unless you're in space, or actually inside a vacuum for that matter. But because there's objects that exist beside the other objects that you've got on your model, those things are basically talking to each other. You've got light bouncing around from section to section, hitting each other and affecting other areas. And so by not sort of removing those colors that have seeped into other areas, what you're getting is a little bit of a sense of realism, because you've got the two surfaces working together. And I think if you use a damp brush anytime you get a little bit of paint on an area you didn't mean to, and just quickly soften that out. It'll usually leave a little bit of a tint of the colour that you tried to wipe out on there, but I actually think that's a real secret benefit from making a mistake, because it will add a little bit of nuance and a little bit of tone of the surrounding areas. So that's why the little mistakes is not something to fixate upon. Big mistakes like choosing the wrong color, that's something that can be pretty demoralizing. But again, because of the approach that I have, which is sketch and refine, I don't tend to make those mistakes until, within the first few minutes, I can realize that's not working and make a change. So I've just utilized the airbrush here. One of the great advantages of the airbrush is the speed. You've probably seen me pull it out many times. It's one of my favorite tools to use. And what I did was I used that verdigris, that green color, to spray from the top down lights, and then I have used a bit more of that cyan and magic blue mixed together to bring back saturation into the blue skin tone. The reason I did that, even though the skin's quite textured, sometimes when you highlight the texturing too much, it doesn't look quite right. Skin is actually one volume. It's one whole surface. Even with the texturing, it's one whole surface. So by doing it this way, it allowed me to just smooth it out and make it look a little bit more unified, and then add in some saturation, some color, and gives a pretty nice effect. And I think I do maybe a little bit more highlighting, but it's not a lot more on the blue. That was a AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. Great stuff. You can also see some overspray that I've got there on that bracer on his forearm. There's a little bit of overspray on other areas. Not a big concern because none of those other areas are finished yet. Relatively easy to correct. Here I'm using a hairdryer to dry out the AK Interactive, and you'll also see what that's done for the contrast paints is it has reduced their shininess down to 0, which is great and allows you to use the contrast paints just for their color properties as opposed to their finish. So one of my secret weapons when I paint with true metallics, and I haven't done a lot of talking about true metallics because recently I've been trying to develop a non-metallic metal style. This is scale 75 something brass, old brass or something like that. Very, very good range of metallic paints, the scale 75 colors. They're actually slightly different sort of finish to a lot of the other metallic colors. They, similar to other scale 75 paints, they almost have a slightly matte finish, which is weird for a metallic color, but I think if you got them and how to play with them, you would understand what I meant, because when you compare the finish of the scale 75 metallics to, say, a Vallejo Model Air or another strong metallic pigment, they don't quite read as truly reflective. But I feel like this is actually one of their strengths, and it's got to do with the way that I talk about contrast, which is not just contrast between light and dark, but also contrast between other things like warm and cold, and in this instance, reflective and non-reflective. And so the way that I use these metallics is they've got very good coverage and they're very smooth finish, which is nice. So I use these for my base coats. Then previously I've used washes, but in this instance I used a contrast color to add some shading and depth. And then I go back in and re-highlight with this same color. And then I mix in a very, very reflective paint such as a Vallejo Model Air Steel or Vallejo Model Air Aluminium, which are extremely thin, extremely strong pigment, very reflective. And so then what you get is a contrast between the dull scale 75 color, which is not as reflective, and the very reflective Vallejo Model Air. So it's a nice effect between those two. But the color range in the Vallejo, in the Scale 75 metallics, is really beautiful. They've got some really nice colors. This one in particular is really nice. That's something. I don't remember what that color is. I think it's Middlestone, I think. Middlestone from Vallejo Model Air. There you go. Middlestone. Great stuff. So I've painted the metallic colors here, and I'm actually going to go in and do a varnish later on. Now with gaming models, I actually do use Tester's Dull Coat. And so that is my favorite varnish. It gives a very, very strong protective coverage. When I've used Tester's Dull Coat on some of my gaming models in the past, it's been very, very unusual for me to have paint chips. So I quite like it for that purpose when I'm using these models for gaming. But it doesn't have the finish necessarily that I like compared to this AK Interactive. So I actually do 2 layers of varnish, one Tester's, which is done basically right before I finish painting the model. So the very last lights on the metallics, the really glinty reflective lights, I do after the final coat of Tester's and then AK Interactive. But I can do most of these other layers of metallics before the varnish, which is contrary to perhaps the way other people approach varnishing their models when they're utilizing trim metallics. I definitely wouldn't recommend using a varnish after you've done trim metallics and finish them, because it will basically kill all of the work that you've done prior to that point. This is Vallejo model color Emerald. Very nice green. Very cold green. Fits in with the rest of the colors on the model. You can see there's a lot of cold colors there. We've got cold blue, cold purple, and now cold green. And then we're contrasting that with the warm gold areas. Generally, I like to take a little bit of a break from painting display stuff every now and then. I just recently finished a pretty in-depth piece with some fairies, and if you have a look on my YouTube channel, it's probably the last video that I uploaded. Took quite a while, and so I think when you have a piece like that, it's nice to have a break, nice to just paint something really just for fun, to experiment with ideas and colors, and so it's nice to have that little break. What are we doing now, Dino? Where are you up to, mate? Ah, yes, Snakebite Leather. I actually use a bit of Snakebite Leather contrast color, but I mix it in with an intensity color called Chestnut. Oh no, apparently I'm doing it on the green as well. That's excellent. I didn't know I did that. Well done. I think I mix it in with a bit of Creed Camo, which is another contrast color, a green color. Yes, very good. But no, I do use Snakebite Leather and a mix of Intense Chestnut for the metallic shading right here. So this is, again, a new evolution in the way that I approach painting gaming minis, tabletop minis. Previously, I would have used a Agrax Earthshade here. So this is a nice evolution. And I'm just using it over the whole thing. It's not pure contrast. I've diluted it fractionally, particularly that ink intensity color. They're very, very strong. So you have to dilute those or they will overpower what is happening. And we'll leave that to dry. Oh no, do a little bit more on some of those areas. That's cool. Go Deno. This is good stuff. I usually have either a TV show on in the background or an audio book or podcast that I'm listening to whilst I'm doing this stuff. So for me, watching these videos back is often a bit surprising because I don't usually, this will sound weird, but I don't usually pay a lot of attention to what I'm doing. I'll just be grabbing colours in a very mechanical way and just doing things. Well, it's not really focusing on what I'm doing, so probably sounds a bit weird. But yeah, it's just very fun, very relaxing approach, this method of painting. So one of the things that's cool in this video is it's going to show a little bit of pigment usage, pigments, another relatively recent addition to my approach. So pigments are the dried color pigments that actually normally in your paint, but removed of any additives and anything like that. And so they're very dry, dusty looking colors, very, very thin bits of pigment if you've never heard of them before. You can usually buy them from a lot of hobby shops these days. There's a number of brands. I think for basing, they're really, really, really cool to experiment with, to have a bit of fun with. On the Rising Sun models, I was again going for speed as opposed to really fixated on a great finish. And so the pigments are used in a very boring way, which is I just plop them on the base. And I'll also show you an example of some of the mistakes that I make, which happens very, very regularly in my use of these pigments, because I then go and do a varnish, which changes the properties of the pigments and also creates some weird frosting. So that's something to look forward to if you're still tuned in. Just having a bit more kombucha. So this is the last few little bits here has been me working on the details. So using that Chimera Black to blackline areas, make sure everything is separate and distinct. Here I'm filling in the eyes. This little dude has faces on his knees, which I imagine would be inconvenient if you ever needed to change a tire or some other activity that involved you crouching on your knees. I'm going to leave that. But that's right, I've got to highlight this green bit before I go. That's great stuff. It's just VGC Emerald or VMC Emerald and then a bit of the verdigris mixed in as well. It's keeping a unified colour for the highlights. Helps the model appear it is in the same environment, which is great. Great stuff. Great tips there. So yeah, just filling in the eyes and separating all those sections, just making sure everything looks distinct and separate objects. Again, this is something that reads much better when you're further away on the table. Having each of those objects be much more distinct and separate just helps the person who's viewing from a distance to understand what they're looking at. Here I'm adding a little bit more of the verdigris, focusing on the face, on his melon, so that that's the area that everyone looks at. And there I'm highlighting some stuff. Very, very quick, as you can see. Oh, remembered I had to do his little sword. He's pulling out his little sword. I don't really think you could call that a katana. It's probably a bit too big for a katana. Great game, Rising Sun, actually. Very fun. You play the role of Japanese clans and you fight wars over various provinces in Japan, and you can recruit monsters and worship different gods from Japanese history. And I'll tell you a very fun story about it, actually. The Kilmeny or Not made a bit of an error in their researching. Most of the research they did was very, very solid and accurate, but they must have just Googled Japanese gods because they were running out of ideas, and loaded up the old Wikipedia page. And on Wikipedia they found a Japanese god called Kotahi, which was a big monkey-like creature. Well, anyway, so they got it sculpted and it looks like Sun Wukong, who's a Chinese monkey king, which is fine. But they labelled it as Kotahi. And anyway, what it turns out had happened is some classic Kiwi guys from New Zealand had gotten onto the Wikipedia page and edited the gods for Japanese history and put shit on one of their mates who they said looked like a big dumb monkey, and they called him the monkey god from Japan, and his name was Kotahi. Kotahi is actually a Maori word. So there you go, fun fact. And that made it all the way through production and to print and to the Kickstarter. And Cool Mini or Not basically didn't sort of mention it when it got noticed. And then about halfway through the campaign, they were like, yeah, sorry, my bad. That's my bad. They just messed it up. So there's this really awesome model, little Japanese monkey guy. But it's based on a Kiwi. And actually the story ends with a very happy ending, because the guy, who's not really much of a board gamer either, I should point out, found out about this, and somehow one of his mates told him, and so Cool Mini or Not got in touch with the guy and sent him a full Kickstarter copy of the game for free. And he got interviewed on his local radio station, on his local TV network, and yeah, very, very funny for a little Kiwi. He was from a small little village in, I believe it was South Island of New Zealand, and he, probably a population of about 11 people where he lived. So and now he's been immortalised in this wonderful game. Great story, great divergence. It's a lot less. It's a lot more difficult to explain some of the more intricate processes that I undertake when I'm painting, when I'm not undertaking those processes because I'm just painting a display model. So all right, so that's a bit more contrast, I think. Might be a bit of Agrax in there as well. And what are we doing now, Big Dano? What are you doing? Mate, just give up on the blue, champion. You've struggled. Doesn't look very good. Just give it up. Give it up, son. Pick a different colour for your next model. Pick purple. You love painting purple? I did paint a lot of purple on my fairy garden piece. Nice colour, purple. Yes, well, this is mostly highlights focused on the upper parts to make sure there's enough attention being drawn. Oh, here we go. This is new. This is a colour called Blue Violet from Vallejo Model Colour. And I looked at those little bracer things. I hadn't originally planned on doing anything to them, but I felt like they looked a little bit naff when you compared to the skin and the rest of the other areas, which looked pretty good. So Felt like I had to do a bit more highlighting of them and couldn't just rest on my contrast laurels. And here we go. So this is hence why I'm doing this. Blue violet. If you have any specific questions, feel free to throw them in the comments below. I've responded to a number of comments about how or why I do things, and I'm always happy to help as much as I can. Here we go, I'm doing some pigments. I'll talk about this right now. So that's water, and that's pigment, and that's it. I guess this is probably not something I should have been looking forward to because it's pretty much, that's it. Yep. Great stuff. Great. This has been a great video, Jenna. I'm very impressed with this. I'm glad that you decided to commentate this whole video instead of just putting some music over it and calling it a day. But anyway, the pigments, this method of using them just fills in the color on the ground and it adds a tiny bit of texture, but the pigments themselves are very, very fine particles, and so it doesn't actually leave that much texture once the pigment and the water dries. But as you can see there, I'm slopping it on and trying to get a bit more. This would work better if there was already some texture on the ground, but I didn't bother doing any sand or anything on the base. The better use for pigments is over a ground or area that's already been painted and then using them for their properties of very dull, dusty looking colors. So that's still wet at the moment. I'm going to grab a hairdryer out and show you what they look like when they're dry. No, apparently I'm going to use Pigment Fixer first. So this is just something that seals the pigment in place. This also leaves that dusty finish if you use it correctly, which is great. You don't actually have to do this if you're going to varnish. But if you were going to do this after varnishing, which is what I would recommend, you would use the Pigment Fixer as the last thing to lock it in place. For a display piece, you probably wouldn't even need to use the Pigment Fixer at all. It's unlikely someone's going to be picking it up. But here we get to watch the magic of pigments as the Pigment Fixer dries thanks to the wonders of the hairdryer, which, as you've probably seen me use many times throughout this process, is an indispensable tool in my arsenal. What is that thing on your finger, Deno? I think that's a bit of super glue, or maybe something. Anyway, look at that pigment stuff. There's still a little bit around the feet there that hasn't quite dried, but you can see that's left a pretty cool finish. And had I not rolled on with some varnish now, and had I done this after the varnish, we would be in much better shape right now. But instead, I'm about to go and hit that with a Tester's dull coat, and you will see all of that really cool greeny color get lost with a frosty finish, with a frosty boy finish. Sadness. So we're reaching the end of this video now, 4 minutes to go, and the total time spent on this model was 1 hour and 45 minutes, which is pretty fun. Very quick, very easy. I will get around to finishing all my Rising Sun models. So if you prefer seeing this type of video where I'm focused more on quick tabletop methods, feel free to let me know. I don't do a lot of these sorts of paint jobs, but if I do decide to paint another Rising Sun model or other models and you'd like to see that, let me know. Look at that frosty finish on the base. What a stitch up. All that cool texture and color lost. Anyway, I do actually fix that. It's not the first time it's happened. So this is the process I was talking about a bit earlier, where I'm going in and using the rest of that surface has been sealed. And if you have a look at various little areas there, you can see how all of the shine's been killed from the varnish. So by doing this layer next, which is a mixture of that brass color and a little bit of Vallejo Model Air steel, you'll start to see that shine coming back. And as I said, you're getting the contrast between the shiny bits and the dull non-reflective bits, which adds a little bit more visual appeal to these areas. So pretty neato to be able to get the benefits of more contrast and protective covering for your models so that you can knock it over with dice and also have it look super cool. Super cool. I've actually been looking forward to painting my Blood Rage models, which is I haven't started any of those yet. I wanted to finish my Rising Sun guys before I started Blood Rage, but I'm super jazzed to paint Blood Rage at the moment because we played quite a few games of it recently and it's a banger. It's about to come out on Steam, digital version, so I'm pretty chuffed to paint the models, which I'll get around to as soon as I finish the remaining 9 models of my Rising Sun collection. Come on, Dano, you can do it. Alright, all of my links for social medias are probably below. If I remembered to, there'll probably be paints that I used on this model. And as I said earlier, if you want to have any questions about how I do things or why I do things, feel free to shoot them my way. If you would like to see more of these types of videos, let me know. Much quicker, probably, than my normal approach, and perhaps less valuable, but you can be the judge of that. And at the end of this video, you will see a fully finished version of this where I will take a photo of it and you will get to see it. And that is great. So you can see at this point here, that's mostly just the steel color mixed in with the brass, and it's looking much more reflective and quite different to what it looked like. And you can see where I'm placing it. It's not everywhere, it's just on the light areas. There you go. Job done. What a great effort. Anyway, that's all from me. I used to sign off my podcast with Big Dano out. So I've been doing that on my painting videos as well. Just a little bit of nostalgia hit. So there you go. Big Dano.